I got into a conversation with a friend of mine recently about whether or not it makes sense to build the same exact type of space again if I were to move, for example. And I told him, no, I don't think it does. Because in today's world, there's not the same need that there may have been, 10, 15, 20 years ago for live drums to be isolated in their own room, or even for a band to be isolated in its own room outside of the control room. That's the typical way studios were always built. There'd be a control room, and then there'd be a live room, and there was total isolation between the two. There was also usually vocal booths, but, that's secondary to the concept of big live room, control room, like think Abbey Road, right? So my thought process here is that I don't think the way people work today, for the most part, most people, I don't think it justifies a build like that. Because the build that I have here cost me tons of time, tons of money, and it's stuff you just don't get back if you wind up like moving, for example. So I'll give you a good example. Like Brendan O'Brien is talking in that interview with Rick Beato, one of my favorite interviews of all time. He's talking to him about, I don't think, what he said was, I built a studio, a pro studio in every house he's ever lived in. Every place he's ever lived, he built like 3. And he wouldn't do it again because he doesn't like working from home, first of all. But second of all, he doesn't ever get live drums he's got to record anymore. I think he said the last time he got live drums, I don't remember when. He said something like that. So the concept is, that's a skill set that you have to hone and that very few people I find have today because it's just not as required. Most people are making beats using some sort of drum track or beat that they buy off a sample pack or something. And this stuff didn't exist years and years back in the same sort of manner that it's so prevalent and dominant like it is today. So it's just the way the world is different. Yeah, there are drummers, but a drummer can easily record in the same room as the control room, and that's more common than not today. More studios you will see today than ever before have the drums within the room, the same room as the controls, all the EQs, all that stuff. And what that means for the engineer is they got to be able to EQ and stuff with headphones on. So this actually branches into the fact that, as I've mentioned before, I am constantly trying to up my game on how well I can mix in headphones and in the box, because my comfort level is at an A+ when it comes to mixing using my hybrid style, both in the box and out of the box, using my NS10s, using my Barefoot 01s. My comfort level is high in this room that way. And I think I need to get comfortable mixing the way a lot of people do today, which is solely in the box and solely wearing headphones. So this is my goal. It's important to have one, and I'm confident I know I will achieve it. I just need to do it for a long enough time, and then I will get there, because I notice little increments of, improvement constantly. So as with anything else, you keep doing it until you get where you gotta go, and that's what I'm doing. But what that also tells me is that I'll be able to get those same drum sounds that I get now with isolation. I can get them in headphones. So if I can get them in headphones, why would I build a live room and all the construction it takes to isolate one room from another? So once you get into that, let me just talk about that for a second. And by the way, I plan on walking around, not in this video, but in a video to come very shortly about, showing you how I built what I built, where the rooms are, what's in them, what the soundproofing situation's like. That's all to come. So stay tuned for that. But in this studio, I have a control room, a live room, a big vocal booth, which also is an amp room, and a quasi vocal booth, which is really just a nice sized air gap of approximately 3 feet between the control room and the live room. So just having that gap is hugely important for sound. I just want to explain this to anybody who has their own build of any kind of what they're doing or they're thinking about it. If you're considering building some sort of studio or you need to isolate from the outside world, the most critical thing you can do is create a room within a room. All right. I'm going to link to this book that I read years ago before I built this. You know, I had done tons of research on it, and it was called Build It Like the Pros. Rod Gervais, I think, is, you know, the author. And it's been around for a long time. There's a second edition now. I'm pretty sure I had the first edition. I don't know. I got to find it. But great book. It goes into details about how to build a room within a room, how to build the right dimensions, the modes. It goes into so much great detail. And it was the best thing I could have ever read at the time. And it was a recommendation off the Gearspace platform. So anyway, that's why and how I built what I built. But it was also because, you know, where I interned had the proper setup. And every place I'd ever recorded prior to that had the proper setup of, you know, when I say proper setup, I mean just the generic old school way to do it. Live room, control room, and then a lot of density in the walls to separate the two, and also to separate it from the outside world, and an air gap between the rooms, because density is not enough if there's no air gap. That's room within a room. That's what that concept is. It's like, if you want to keep sound from getting out, you need to build an airtight box within another airtight box. That's really what you have to do, because if the walls touch, then the sound vibrations get through, especially stuff like bass, and it gets out. All right, so this is going to be kick drum, bass guitar, any sort of stuff like that with amplifiers gets out. So that's what you need to do. Room within a room, totally waterproof, essentially. Like if water can get out in any way, you picture the room like a fish tank filled up with water, if water can get out, sound can get out. So it's got to be airtight, all right? And granted, it doesn't have to be, but every compromise you make is a compromise where now sound will escape more so than if you didn't. That's all. So you got to think about it like that. So in my situation, by building my two rooms with, you know, as double layer 5/8 of an inch, what is it, sheetrock, you know, 5/8 of an inch thick, not ½ inch, which is the smaller stuff, the 5/8, and doubled the layers up and put green glue in between the layers, and then put these isolation clips, which essentially make it where the vibration can't get through straight to the studs and then straight to the other side. You're putting isolation clips on both sides. I mean, you're doing all sorts of stuff to be able to make it where now your room is separate and the vibrations don't come through, and it can actually be where you get isolation. Otherwise, you just put up two rooms and you could still hear the drums playing. Trust me. Anybody who's ever like tried to just do it out of what they had in a house or something, you know, you get that. And, you know, when you think about Blood Sugar Sex Magik, they recorded that in a house that was far enough away from other things, because if they didn't, just that space between the houses, you know, if it's not enough, they will hear you and it's going to be a problem. So you need enough space. That air gap outside is just as important. You need space between you and the next, wherever you're at, so that there's no issues. But also, they built an airlock between, you know, where they were in the study compared to the living room. Like, there was a totally isolated room between the two so that they could hear in complete isolation when they were making all their EQ moves, their mix decisions on everything, and the recording stuff is happening in the other room. So that's what I mean by the traditional way. It's just today, in today's world, more often than not, I've seen tons of people, basically one big room, and they, if they need to, they put up some sort of, you know, plexi movable isolation between stuff just to get a little bit of sound deadening between them and their, like, everybody else and their, you know, the guy sitting at the board, if they need to. But a lot of times it's just in the same room, because they're usually dealing with one artist, like a singer-songwriter type of dude, you know, and that's the most part of the work. And then sometimes you're recording guitars, sometimes you're recording, you know, a guy playing bass or whatever, but you could do this all in one room and, you know, put the amp outside of that room anywhere, and it's fine. You put it in one of those boxes. It doesn't cost near what it costs to build an isolated room as a vocal booth, or as, I mean, it just doesn't cost nearly the same to put something in an isolated box. So when you're thinking about, you know, how often are you going to use that live room, and then how often are you going to use your control room? And in my case, I'm in my control room every day, because I'm here whether I'm mixing, whether I'm mastering, whether I'm making videos, whether I'm editing tracks, whether I'm recording with a singer. Like, 'cause a lot of times, rather than use the vocal booth in the live room, even though I have the build, it's so much easier to talk without the talk back. You know, and you could just talk to them and then play back stuff on the monitors, and it's like, it's a whole different vibe that's the benefit of having the singer in the room with you. It's a way more intimate, chill, casual type of vibe than having them, you know, talk through through the talk back into their headphones. It's a whole different thing. So I actually like it better in one room, is what I realized. So I would not spend the money to do that again. And I don't think in this world today that it really justifies it, because if I did need super isolation or to record like a whole band at one time, I'd probably just rent space to do that, because it's not as often that you get that scenario compared to how often you get the other scenario, and how often I get the stuff I do most, which is, you know, I'm always in the control room all the time. So that's the room that I spend all my time in, and spending a ton of money on separating another room that's going to be space and money and time to do. And it's like, why? You know, it's not smart. So I don't think I will do that. For me, it doesn't make sense for me. You know, depending on who you are and what you're doing, it might be different. But I just want everybody to consider this, and consider, if you're planning on doing that, your distance between other people is extremely important. If you can somehow be underground or partially underground, that density between you and the next house, it doesn't matter as much, because the ground is super dense. That's the same reason why I had, like, my great drummer friend, he's talking about, how do I build a place I could play drums when he, you know, gets a new house? What's he going to do? And I'm like, just, you know, think about it like this. You need to create a brick solid wall, you know, as your first layer, and then build another brick solid wall within that, because the density between those two things, if there's an air gap between the two, they're not going to let anything out to the outside world. So you could make it nice and sheetrock it or whatever you want to do, but the concept here is the more density you have, the more of a shot you have of stuff won't get out. So if you're right on top of another house and you want to live that way, somewhere like in a city or some place where it's really, houses are tight together, that's really your only option, is lots of density, very, you know, to be able to do this. And there's things like green glue that help. Those sound isolation clips, you know, help. The green glue is basically like this rubbery, like, thing that basically takes the vibrations and calms them down, so they don't just transfer from one dense surface into another. Just like the isolation clips, it's a way of creating like sort of a spring-loaded kind of situation, where when something hits it, it doesn't just transfer the sound right through to the other side. It, you know, just the fact that it's not directly on the studs, it doesn't just send it through, it helps a lot. So, you know, those clips go on the studs, then the sheetrock goes on that, and you're using double layers, 2 layers of 5/8. You're really thickening it up. And some people use more. If you listen, read that book, that Rod Gervais book. It is huge for explaining how to do this stuff. All right, and concept-wise, windows, you know, there's a lot of things people do to just, you know, the windows they got to be the double pane. They got to be the heavy-duty soundproof stuff, or you got no shot at not getting, you know, disturbing your neighbors. You got to not disturb the neighbors, because that's the thing. Like, you want to be able to work in peace, and at any time. That's been my experience, because musicians don't typically keep normal hours. You know, that's just how it is. We can't, I mean, maybe some people do. I know some people that are very strict schedule-wise, but I've just been someone that's always sort of been on weird hours. So that's how I work best. I'm curious how you work best. Do me a favor, throw it in the comments. How'd you build your room? What has worked for you or hasn't? Like, how are you going to do the next one? I'm just curious about all this, because as we go through, you know, our opinions change. You know, there were so many sound traps here that I helped build, and a lot of people built, you know, that was part of this build, was like, I had all this help to build these sound traps. And the sound traps are, you know, the Owens Corning, and I'm going to go around and show you guys everything, but they're that 4-inch thick stuff, super thick, and they're off the wall by several inches in order to make it where there's an air gap behind them. That does so much more than you know for the sound to not bank back at you. It goes through them, it hits that air gap between them, and then it has a hard time coming back, as opposed to if it was right up against the wall, which wouldn't be nearly as good for what it would do. And all my corners are taken out with those triangle pieces all the way down, you know, so there's so much here. There's a ceiling cloud, which is also 4 inches thick. When you build this stuff, it is heavy. It's because it's just a lot of it. You know, it's all made in like those 2 feet by 4 feet pieces that get pushed together, you know, and the ceiling cloud is, I don't know, 8 feet or something, you know, it's a lot. You know, there's a lot. I think this is like 8x4. I don't know. We're going to go into it. We'll get into detail on a bunch of stuff on how the rooms are, because I think this is important. You know, it's important for you guys to see what I did so you might know what not to do and to hear from other people, because everyone's going to have their own view on this. And I think a lot of people are going to come from interesting places. I'm excited to hear it. All right. I hope you liked the video. If you did, do me a favor. Hit the like button. It helps me out a lot. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. My name's Evan Jaffe. This is Custom Cut Studios. I just want to remind you guys, you got this. All right. Take it easy.